Square Booksellers, and we're welcoming two authors today, both named Eileen, and they're going to read about their new novels. And we're talking about Ireland and our ethnic cultures, and see what we can learn today. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Pat and Alan. And Miles, thank you so much for inviting us. We are two Eileens, and we're also cousins, which we discovered when, do you see a family resemblance? But the funny thing is, we're not cousins on our Irish side. We both are of mixed ancestry, and we are cousins on our French side. And how do we know that? It becomes very apparent when you realize we both have the same first name and the same last name.
Oh my God.
The Charbonneaus married there's a lot of Irish, French, Franco-Irish marriages in America, especially in our melting pot areas like New England, Boston, New York. And we're the product of two of them, and we ended up with the same name. So poor Eileen, because I was published first, she had to take a pseudonym so we wouldn't be too mixed up. But I'm so happy to know her and to discover her through her writing. Her book was a life changer for me. It's so beautiful. And it deals with the same period as my book, but they're very, very different stories. And I'm so proud and happy to know her and to be, I hope this is the first of many times we can have some talks together. So because we're in the same period, which is the period of Angor Tamor. Angor Tamor is Gaelic for the Great Hunger. The Irish do not call the years between 1845 and 1850 famine years, because they really weren't a famine. They were one crop failure that decimated a whole people in a very, very devastating way. So that's the Angor Tamor period. We're both in that. My dress is in that period. The weather today is very Irish. This is what my grandmother would call a wee misting. It's but a wee misting, Eileen. So what I will do is give you a little Irish history before we get to Angor Tamor to start my talk today. And I won't go all the way back to the woolly mammoths. I'll only go about 5,000 years, and then Eileen can take over in the 19th century and tell you about that terrible period of Irish history. But if you've ever seen Irish rings, there's the Claddagh ring, with the heart in the middle and the two hands. There's also an Irish history ring, which my friend Paul Linus, who is a great resource for me in my book, Rachel Lemoyne, he gave me one to honor me and when I wrote it. And what is on the Irish history rings is the Irish culture, the Celtic Irish, did not have a written culture. It was all oral. It was all storytelling. So they're very into pictographs, a lot like our Native Americans here, our pictographs right underneath the bridge. These are another pictograph people. That one picture tells a whole story and reminds you of a whole story or a whole period. So these Irish history rings are these very beautiful rings with these pictographs on them. So Paulinus gave me one, so I copied them off my ring to to start our Irish history. This is where it starts. This is the Celtic spiral, the Celtic swirl it's called. It's no beginning, no end, and it dates back 5,000 years. If you ever go to Ireland, just above Drogheda in Ireland, above the city of Dublin, is a place called Newgrange. There are burial sites in Newgrange with this symbol all over them, and it's incorporated into all of Irish history. Irish love these never-ending circles, these snakes that eat each other. And it's all about birth and death and rebirth and change and how, the more things change, the more they remain the same. That's all embedded in that Celtic swirl. And it's this place in Ireland is older than the pyramids. It's ancient. And on one day of the year, the winter solstice, a light comes through, bounces off walls, and it lightens a chamber. So these people knew their calendar. They were like the Mayans in that. They had a very precise calendar. They knew what was going to happen with the sun. They knew the constellations. They knew how to travel through celestial navigation, through watching the stars. So these were a wonderful culture that we don't know a lot about it because it's so old, older than the Greeks, older than the Egyptians, older than all. But the Celts revere them, the culture that came next. And here we're going to jump up from 5,000 years to the 5th century AD, St. Patrick. Okay, so St. Patrick came, not an Irish person at all, although the Irish love him and they're their patron saint. He's a Roman, and he can't stand the Irish. He thinks they're terrible heathens, and he's come to bring them Christianity. But he also wrote the earlier stories. The great myths of the Celtic Irish are Oisin and the Fianna and all these wonderful stories. And he had his monks copy them down. As he got to know and fell in love with this people, he realized that to bring Christianity to these people, you have to fall in love with them first and want them as your kin. So he did things like bring the shamrock to it. The story is the shamrock is the three personage of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's kind of an apocryphal story because the Irish knew exactly what he was talking about because their culture was all full of triune gods. They had a male one, a female one. Mm-hmm. Their female one was St. Bridget, so St. Patrick got a little nervous because we're not big on female deities in Christianity. So he said, oh, well, I'll tell you what, we've got St. Bridget. We'll make a St. Bridget taking the place of the triune Bridget, the triune goddess. And so he transferred this. He transferred goddesses and gods to saints. He says, we've got that covered, and we've got a triple god for you too. And the Celtic people are like, oh, we know what he's talking about. Sure, we'll take this new philosophy in our quiver. It's very interesting. We'll skip ahead to the Round Tower, which is also on my Irish ring. This is from the 6th century. This is the monastic culture. If you've ever heard of that wonderful book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, that's this period. This is when the monks are writing down, because the barbarian hordes are going all over Europe and destroying the temples, the Roman culture, the Greek culture, and they started the monastic, the monks realized that this was important to preserve. So they started writing them all down. That's why we have a lot of what we have of Aristophanes and all of Plato and Socrates and all the Greeks and Romans were preserved in that period. These are so old they don't really know what they were originally for. They think that they were bell towers, but then when they started to be the invasion period, the later invasion period, the people would store food up there and hide up there if the Vikings were coming or stuff. But the beginnings of them, there's only about 20 left. There were once 2,000 of them all over Ireland, but there's only 20 full ones left, and they're wonderful to visit as well. You really get the sense of history. So now we're in the invasion period, and all kinds of invasion. That's why the Irish language is so rich, and they added so much to English because of all these invading cultures. These two little islands, Great Britain and Ireland, just kept getting invaded by other people who added to the culture and added to the language, and that's why English is so rich. It has so many words. It has so many ways to say things that when I tell my friends in Italy or France that I write in English, I say, oh, you're so lucky to write in English because you have such this beautiful language and full and delicious language to write in. So we're going to go on to the next invaders, the Vikings. We know about the Vikings. That's the 9th to the 11th century. And they came until they were defeated by Brian Boru. But they didn't really just come in. You kind of have this idea of the general popular culture and television. Vikings are the ones who come in and they maraud and kill everybody and steal all the gold and then go home. And the Vikings didn't do that in Ireland entirely. They kind of liked Ireland and they founded cities. The city of Dublin, that's a Danish word, that means black water. It's on that Liffey. So they founded Dublin, they founded Waterford, they founded Cork, they founded Limerick. These are all Viking towns. So I'm sure if Eileen does her DNA, she's going to find a little Viking blood, as there are in mine. I have Danish and Norwegian blood as well as part of the Irish. Almost all the Irish people have a little of that in them, because they did come and stay and intermarry. Okay, where are we? The next invaders. These are the Normans. The Normans were French speakers, and they came in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, and they are responsible for the great castle culture in Ireland. You see these wonderful, like Cashel. The Rock of Cashel has Romanesque and Gothic from this period. They were French-speaking and French culture, but they came kind of from all over. The North Brittany they came from, and they were also from some of the Norwegian, but their culture was French. And they had a very important king, Henri II was one of the invaders. And because Henri came in and he was driven out, because they kept driving them back out. But once Henri II came in, that gave the basis for the English to say, oh, we were always in Ireland, all the way from back here. They really weren't. But that was their kind of modus operandi for taking over Ireland in the later periods, in the Elizabethan periods. But the Normans left their mark too. They stayed in. My Irish ancestors are from the west of Ireland, in County Leitrim. And County Leitrim is in the far west, and it was considered very desolate. And if the English, were like bringing somebody up on treason, sometimes they would either kill them or they could choose to be banished. And there was this phrase, do you want to go to hell or do you want to go to Connaught? And that's where my people are from. And some of them, I imagine, preferred death than to go to County Mayo or County Leitrim. But those were the Normans. And in my family, my grandmother's name was Flynn. Her maiden name was Flynn. And now this is my great-grandmother, was named Flynn, but she married a Gilmartin. And Flynn is a Celtic name, and it means the fox or the red-haired. Looks like. I think got a little of that, a little Flynn blood in her. So that was the Celtic. But the man she married, Thomas Gilmartin, his name means Gilmartin, the sons of the followers of Saint Martin. So these are people who kind of dedicated themselves to one saint or another. And Saint Martin is not an Irish saint. He's Saint Martin of Tours. And if you know where Tours is, it's in France. So he was the Norman connection. So I have both Norman Irish and Celtic Irish through that great-grandmother and her parents. Okay, so we'll put that English and Norman, because of course the Normans also invaded England, 1066 and all that, William and Conqueror. So they are very much a part of the English culture as well. When it was a Saxon kingdom, the Normans came in. So this is part French and part English culture. Okay, we're going to jump to the 19th century. And this on my ring is the only one that's they're all kind of beautiful and storytelling. This one is ugly, and it's horrible. And it's Angoutamore. It's the famine. We're up to the Great Famine now. It was a horrible, horrible period in Irish history. It produced two things: death and immigration. Between the year in 1850, there were 8 million people in Ireland. By the time the immigration slowed down, about 1900, there were 4.5 million, and they have never recovered. But the great blessing inside of Angoutamore, this terrible, terrible period, is the Irish diaspora. They went everywhere, to every continent, and they enriched our lives, and they enriched the culture of everywhere they went. They bloomed where they're planted, to pick up our theme for today. The Irish immigrants bloomed where they're planted, and they are now all over the world. So that very many people from all over the world trace their ancestry to that little island next to England, even smaller than England and Great Britain. the thing I'm very proud of my Irish ancestors is that they are everywhere now. Because of Angkor Tamor, when you turn on your television and you hear about a famine in Africa or something happening in the Middle East, you'll hear the reporter with a little Irish accent, because they have never forgotten what it's like to be hungry. So they'll go there and report, they'll go there and act as relief workers, because they never forgot. They never forgot what happened to them then. So my story is Rachel Lemoyne, and it's a story that I found inside, and my friend Paulinus, who gave me that history ring that this is all from, he told me this story, that in the midst of the famine, the Choctaw Indians of America started reading about this terrible famine in Ireland, and they decided, we have to do something to help them. They were only 11 years from their own immigration. Their immigration was in 1831, and that was the Trail of Tears. They were on the first Trail of Tears. Of course, there are many, many Trail of Tears of Indians and Native Americans being displaced and moved, usually west or south or north. And theirs was in 18, so they're only 11 years away from that, and they're reading about the Irish. And they happened to have a surplus corn crop that year. And they said, we have a little extra money. Let's go help the Irish. And I told my friend Paulinus, who's Irish, and I said, Paulinus, this wonderful thing happened that the Choctaw Indians did. And he said, we know all about that. And I said, this is the first I know. I'm American, and I didn't know about this. And he said, there's a monument in the middle of Dublin to the Choctaw Indians, because the Irish never forgot how generous these very, very poor people in the midst of their own troubles were to them. So I thought, as a storyteller, there's a story there. So I wanted to personify that great gift of the Choctaw to the Irish. So I wrote a story called Rachel Lemoyne. Now Rachel Lemoyne is a Choctaw who was a translator, an intermediary between her people and the larger culture in America. By this time, they've been moved from their ancestral land, which is around Alabama, Mississippi, kind of going up the river there. They got displaced, and they were part of what's called the 5 civilized tribes. In other words, they were not living in teepees or wigwams. They were not hunting and gathering. They were not even seasonal. They were farmers. They had, many of them were Christian. Some of them still followed the traditional religion, but some of them were also Christian, and Rachel was one of them. She had converted to Presbyterianism. And so when they were moved, they were not hunting buffalo or doing anything like that. They were living as farmers on their own land in the South, and they were told they had to leave because there were other people coming in, and of course there was usually either a land rush or a gold rush, and this was the time of the great sweep of the cotton crop was going across the South. And they did not grow cotton. I mean, it would be silly for them to grow cotton. They were growing traditionally the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, to get along, and they wanted that land. The planters and the new people coming in from the South that were moving west wanted that land to grow, to either look for gold, because it's always either look for gold, or start a cash crop. So they were removed. So Rachel had done her first blooming where she's planting when she moved from her ancestral land to Oklahoma. And when I was researching that part of the book, I realized that Rachel would have been a child then. So I put her in a family and had a ceremony that I read about that was very moving to me and connected with the Celtic culture. The wonderful thing I found out when I was writing this book, I thought I was going to be writing about 2 very different kinds of people. And the more I researched, the more I realized how much similarity there were. One of the things that's very similar between Celtic people and most Native American people is a real reverence for living things. And some things are really special to them. And for the Native Americans and the Celtic people, trees. trees were like holy spaces, the base of a tree and the leaves of the tree, and always so grateful for trees. So during the removal of the Cherokee people, the women and the children went from each farm, from farm to farm, to say goodbye to the trees. And a great tree in their tradition is the oak tree. So they would take the leaves and they would brush them against their faces. And when a child was born, the first thing they would do would be to plant a tree in the child's name. So I thought that ceremony was so beautiful that I began the book with that, to Rachel's own moving and to this ceremony of saying goodbye to the tree. So I'll read you a little from that. So I have Rachel, her father is a translator called Peter Lemoyne, and she's a mixed blood, so she's got some French in her as well, as many of the Choctaw did, because the French traders were up and down the Mississippi like our ancestors did, the voyageurs, the coureurs de bois, the people who traded with the Indians. So Peter, her father, is a translator, and that in the native culture, they have this idea that they're communal, but they're also very individualistic. So they would never like sign a treaty and say, okay, we signed a treaty, we're all going to Oklahoma, everybody go. They honored the individuality, that if you didn't want to do, you either could start your own band or you could go someplace else. So Peter, you have this idea of Peter Lemoyne being a translator and trying to explain to them what the deal was for going. And they already had done they did 3 immigrations. And the first one was terrible. There was a terrible winter, and they lost a lot of people along the Trail of Tears, and that's why it became known as the Trail of Tears. There was always a lot of loss. So this is the second one. So she's in the middle migration. She's about ready to go to that one. I think that's all I have to tell you. Okay. Her mother moved on to the oaks. She took their sunset-colored leaves between her hands to her cheek, both the bright, touched by sunside, and the pale underbellies. She bent a branch of the tree down to Rachel. Rachel took the red leaf between her fingers. Thank you for the shade, and welcome into your limbs, and the seed pockets that Atoka, that's her brother, and I made into twirl toys and nose ornaments. Rachel let the thoughts flow through her fingertips to the oak's understanding. In return, she felt the tree's strength and sorrow at parting, felt its blood singing another lament. Her mother took her hand and led on. The women followed Elizabeth Lemoyne, honoring their trees in farewell, proceeding to the next homestead and the next, stroking the leaves. Some wept silently. None of the children, who ranged in age from 11 years to Turtle Woman's 6-day child, were afraid of their mother's wet cheeks. Finally, down the road, the Federal soldiers waited, their blue uniforms striking against the gray sky. This journey would not become the horror of last year's group, their leader, Captain Armstrong, proclaimed. Peter Lemoyne's clear voice translated the captain's English into Choctaw. Atoka sat tall on his mount, like Swatter, beside their father on Two Hearts. Her brother's eyes were angry and cold until they found hers. They lit with a gruff tenderness then. For her, their mother, the baby. We honor you, they say. Carry the seeds in your pouches. We will bring you to a new land. We will live again. Surely the vicious snowstorms and cold of last year were unusual, unpredictable. This year's band was departing earlier. The steamships would be waiting at Natchez to carry them up the Mississippi and its tributaries. From Little Rock, they would walk to their new land. Last year, hundreds had starved when heavy rains washed out roads and trails, slowing them to 15 miles a day. Not this year, Captain Armstrong proclaimed. This year, President Jackson had put the Army in charge. Worry strained Rachel's father's clear, beautiful voice. He'd met Andrew Jackson once on Choctaw land. He had seen the American leader lose control of his temper. Old Hickory disliked asking for anything, her father had said. He preferred to threaten. There were only 2 choices, Andrew Jackson said, for the people standing in the way of progress: immigration or extinction. And now, this man, who had turned on his own wartime allies, the Creek, was President of the United States. It was time to think about a new country, even Peter Lemoyne advised. Still, he had walked out to their wood pile alone. and Rachel followed. It was the only time she had seen her father weep. Now his eyes scanned the small wagons loaded with provisions for 6,000. How many blankets, how much food would be enough? Rachel almost heard his thoughts. And what happened to that second migration was even worse. And they lost a lot of people, so in my story I have Rachel and her brother Atoka are the only survivors in the family. So they get to Oklahoma, and she becomes a teacher for children. She converts to the Presbyterian from the missionaries, and they decide that she's going to go to Ireland with their surplus corn crop and feed the Irish. So that's where the adventure takes leave. And 11 years later, we jump to Angor, and Rachel is in Ireland, and she's got a problem. I know that some other kind American ships have left off some corn previous to this, but the Irish don't know what to do with corn. Their grains are wheat and barley and oats, and they don't realize that corn has to be ground a different way. So they don't grind it fine enough. They feed it to starving people, and it's so sharp that it bursts their intestines and kills them instantly. So they're very suspicious of this new corn crop. But Rachel knows what to do with corn because she's a Choctaw. And she knows that she needs to find a millwright who can change the stones to grind it finer so that she can help feed the people. So she goes searching for the millwright, and the millwright's name is Dare Ronan. And Dare Ronan has lost his entire family. He's lost his wife, he's lost all his children to the famine, and he's waiting to die under a tree, because the trees are sacred to the Celtic people too, and he's just waiting to die. And Rachel's got to scout him up and make him get on. He's also a wanted man, because he's again like a translator, like an intermediary, like Rachel is with her people, and this is dangerous at this time, because the English think that he's looking to overthrow the government. He can read and write. He's talking to. There's always a rebel group in Ireland, and at this period it's called Young Ireland. So he's helping them set type for their newspaper. So that's made him a wanted man by the English. So the English are looking for him, and he just wants to die because he's lost his whole family. But Rachel's got to kind of get him out of himself, and he's such a wanted man that she's got to haul him out of Ireland and marry him on the boat so that he can get into Ireland. So she marries him on the boat, and they go on the Oregon Trail together and head out to Oregon and have an adventure together. I really, really enjoyed writing this book. Yeah, they ended up a long way, and of course he's never seen a snake, and you know what happens on all the wagon trails.
Yeah,
There's always snakes.
Yeah.
So before I read this, let's see. Let me just see what time it is, because I don't want to take. Okay. I just want to give you a little taste of what the Celtic language is. So let me sing you a Celtic lullaby so you can hear what it sounds, what the Irish language sounds like. Elini, Elini, Cathalidi, Cathalidi, Elini, Elini, Cathalidi, 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 Sukir Sastra, Sukir Sastra, Cathalidi, Cathalidi, Kushabaino, Kushabaino. I took a little bit of a chance singing you that, because it is a lullaby, which is a spell song to put you to sleep. So I'm glad you're all still awake. But you can hear from the language that it bears no resemblance to any other language in Europe, and they think the Celtic ancient, and again, it's reflecting this whole culture, and they think originally they came from the way, way far east, where the only thing that it's close to is Sanskrit. So they might have come out of what is now India thousands of years ago, the oldest, and they retained that language and the sound of the language in Irish. Okay, so my next passage will be Rachel finding, and of course it's just rife for misunderstandings. Rachel's first language is not English, it's Choctaw. Dale Ronan's first language is Irish. It's not English. So their only common language is English. So I had a lot of fun just realizing that both of them are trying to understand each other in languages that weren't born speaking. So English is this beautiful, again, what I was saying about English, this beautiful common language that's got words for everything, and it's got all these other cultures put in them because they were always either through immigration or through invasion. All these other languages lent words to it. It's the Native Americans is why we have, moccasin and rodeo and these beautiful Spanish words and beautiful French words and all within the language. And so here's poor Rachel trying to get Dare out of his tree. Rachel led the man, who seemed to be made of straw, into the clearing dawn mist. He realized he released her hand. His sunken eyes surveyed a tight circle, then a wider one. He did not move from her side. Where are they? Even his voice was cracked, dry, straw-like. Who? The marksmen. There are no marksmen, Rachel said, perplexed. Gaunt face, but those eyes still held life. I will not hurt you. I will not take you hostage or use you as a shield. Just tell me where they are so I have a chance. And I tell you that no one tracked me here. He didn't believe her. His eyes kept up their wild, hunted search of the settling mist, the shrubs, the heather banks on the surrounding hills. Many warned me not to come, Rachel said, trying to anchor those frantic eyes. Why did you come then? Why do American Red Indians bring corn to Manor Hamilton? Because we are no strangers to suffering, and because we are all children of God. God, is it? Your God? He took her arm in his bony grasp. Startled, Rachel faced him. He had the age-obliterating look of all the starving people she'd seen, even the children. What religion are you? He demanded suddenly. Church of England? No. What church? I'm Presbyterian. Bloody Scots Protestant, he muttered with only a little less disgust. The pledge. You'd have us take the pledge, then? The pledge. To your church, woman, your Protestant church, before we might have this gift of your Indian corn. We must renounce our religion. No, of course not, he released her abruptly. I have heard such things. Not about us, not about the Choctaw people. I have your word on this. You do. He searched the hills again before his fierce eyes that reflected the mist, the gray dawn sky, grew wistful. That and his slanting brows changed the look of him completely. So, let us repair to the mill and grind your corn, Rachel Lemoyne, queen of the Choctaw. Rachel frowned. We have no queens except in silly European stories. And it is now your corn, sir, and that of your neighbors. And now it's my great, great pleasure to introduce my cousin, who also wrote this period in a very beautiful way of who made up. We'll find out who made up this wonderful immigrant population. Amen.
Thank you, Eileen. That was beautiful, wonderful talk. And thank you for setting this up. And I want to thank Alan and Pat for hosting us and everyone for coming. My novel, Callageen, tells the story of Angkor Amor, the Great Hunger, often referred to as the Irish Potato Famine. It's the story of what forced so many, about 1 million, to leave Ireland in search of a better life, or in many cases in search of mere survival. Emigration from Ireland to America did not begin with the famine, nor did it end once the famine was over, but there was certainly a large concentration of immigrants from Ireland to America during the famine, and with good reason. Some of my own Irish ancestors came to America during the famine. I know this because my aunt spent many years studying the family genealogy, and the dates of immigration from Ireland to America correspond to the dates of the famine. Now, while Callageen, my book, is fiction, it's deeply rooted in solid historical research. The hardships faced by the characters in my story could easily have been faced by my own Irish ancestors, as well as the ancestors of anyone here whose forebears came over during the famine or within a reasonable time thereafter. My study of what life was like for the Irish during the famine and what drove them to leave their homes and their families for a perilous journey, one many did not survive, has given me a tremendous respect for the resilience, strength, faith, and courage of these people, and I'm proud to have come from their stock. Now, did you know that potatoes are not native to Ireland? They actually originated in South America and were brought to Europe around 1570 by the Spanish. Supposedly in 1589, Sir Walter Raleigh brought the potato to Ireland, where he planted them at his Irish estate Myrtle Grove near Cork. It took about 4 decades for the potato to spread through Europe. One of the main characters in Kelligeen is a young bride-to-be named Meg O'Connor. The O'Connors live on land that belonged to their own clan, but after the British took control of Ireland, Meg's ancestors were reduced to paying rent for their small plot of land and their little thatched roof cottage. They faced the twice yearly threat of eviction if their rent was not paid in full and on time to their absentee English landlord. And by the way, I use the term cottage for their dwelling places throughout the book, even though the Irish tended to refer to them as cabins, because I worried that American readers would conjure the image of the iconic log cabin, and that's not at all what their homes were like. They were small, one-room deep structures with thatched roofs. The length of the timbers available for the roof determined the width of the house. In areas along Ireland's coast, the main source of rafters came from timber washed ashore from shipwrecks. These homes had mud floors, a hearth, very little furniture, and at the most, one window. If they had any animals, such as a pig, it often lived in the house with the family because it's the family's most valuable asset. Now, you may wonder how it came to be that the Irish at that time no longer had ownership of land that had once belonged solely to them. To answer that, we must go back to a time before the setting of Kelligeen. In the 1600s, civil war broke out in England, ending with the execution of King Charles I and the assumption of the title Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland by the Puritan Oliver Cromwell. Predominantly Roman Catholic, Ireland continued to support the Catholic Stuart monarchy of England, bringing Cromwell's invading army into Ireland. After a series of bloody battles, Cromwell's Puritan army seized control of Ireland, deported over 100,000 Irish, and transplanted their English followers to claim ownership of the land. After Cromwell's death, the sympathetic Stuart monarchy was restored. Yet in 1688, King James II, a Catholic, was forced to flee. He went to Ireland and there raised an army in an attempt to regain his throne. In the meantime, England's Parliament declared the throne vacant and invited Prince William of Orange and his wife, James's oldest child, Mary, to rule. James II lost the decisive Battle of the Boyne and he never regained the throne. In 1695, William and Mary imposed the penal laws on Ireland, banning Roman Catholicism. Deprived of their homes and their wealth, the Irish could no longer own or purchase land unless they converted to Protestantism. Catholics could not vote, practice law, join the army, keep a horse, keep a gun, carry a sword, or hold a public office. Priests were arrested and Catholic schools were closed. In an age when education was largely a province of the church, this made education virtually impossible for the Irish. The Catholic Irish clung tightly to their faith nonetheless, holding mass in secret locations and risking harsh punishment if they were caught. Irish who once owned and governed their own land, their own country, were turned into a destitute race, working what was once their own land for English-born and later descendants of English-born, now known as Anglo-Irish, landlords. The penal laws were finally repealed in 1829, only 16 years before the famine. By then, the Irish had learned to survive on little other than the potato. Other food existed in abundance in Ireland, but the Irish were too poor to purchase it. Tenant farmers raised crops and livestock for their English landlords. Some of that food was sold in the Irish marketplaces, but the vast majority of it was exported to England. Only the lowly potato, which they could plant and harvest themselves and which grew well in Ireland's rocky, marshy soil, was affordable and available to them. The English and most of Europe looked upon the potato and other root crops as cattle fodder. Not wanting it for themselves and not having a viable market for it, they left it alone for the Irish to survive on. Fortunately for the Irish peasants, the potato is an incredibly nutritious food. Loaded with vitamins and minerals, it has the ability to not only sustain life, but also to allow it to thrive. Ireland's peasants, who lived on a diet of potatoes and only the occasional chicken, egg, cheese, and milk, were the hardiest and healthiest peasants in Europe. Though monotonous, this diet accounted for a people with strong bones, healthy teeth, and a robust vitality. The Irish did not choose the potato as the mainstay of their diet. Rather, it was forced upon them by political circumstances. When it failed, the Irish starved. By the time the famine hit, the worst of the penal laws had been repealed and the Catholic Church had been grudgingly reinstated. But the land did not belong to the Irish people. Their language had been outlawed, though many continued to speak it amongst themselves, and the potato had become almost their sole source of nourishment. There was plenty of food in Ireland besides potatoes. In fact, there was enough food in Ireland to feed the entire country during the famine. But by law, it belonged to the English, who were unwilling to change their economic policies for the sake of saving Irish lives. As a result, all that food was sold to those who could afford to pay for it, and the rest was shipped out of the country for profit. Ireland's potatoes were destroyed by a fungal blight known as Phytophthora infestans, an oomycete, a type of single-celled organism related to brown algae, and it spread through the air. It develops when weather conditions are warm and humid. Long before 1845, the blight probably circulated through central Mexico, where it infected wild relatives of the potato. When it arrived in Europe, it had never hit cultivated potatoes before. It spread rapidly through Ireland, where the potato was intensively cultivated. It was a devastating blight, destroying the tops, the tubers, every part of the potato, leaving nothing at all edible. Though Ireland was not the only country struck by the potato blight, it was much more devastating for them because the populations of other countries could rely on their other crops, but Ireland's peasants could not. To give a bit of an understanding about what it was like for the Irish people to discover this blight upon their crops, I'd like to read a selection from Kelligeen. Dennis and Father O'Malley went outside, walking around the cottage toward the potato bed. "It's going to rain again," Dennis said in disgust, holding his hands, palms up as if he could feel the rain coming. "I'd better get home before I'm drenched." Despite the coming rain, Father O'Malley took time to inhale deeply as he walked. The smell of the earth just before a storm was sweet. He might get caught in a downpour, but it made no difference as long as he could feel the land under his feet, breathe the air, and hear the sea lap in the distance. Look at all the incredible beauty the good Lord has created, and I am blessed to be a part of it. He hurried his steps as he watched the puffy clouds tumble end over end down the hills, entering his cottage just before the first drops fell. No sooner had he closed the door behind him than the thunder let go with a mighty crack, shaking the walls. Within seconds, the rain became a pelting torrent. Thunder boomed again. He looked up in time to see lightning flash through the only window. Once in bed, he stared into the darkness. Usually, he enjoyed a good rip-roaring thunderstorm. He loved listening to the fury without while he was tucked safe inside. The sound of tonight's storm, truly no different from any other, unnerved him, though he couldn't explain why. He wondered if Deirdre felt the same. When he opened his door the next morning and stepped outside, he was immediately engulfed in white fog. "'Tis uncommon thick," he thought, "like I've wandered into a sea of cream." As he walked to the church, he thought he detected a strange, unpleasant odor in the air. By the time Mass ended, the fog had begun to lift. Stepping outside, that same smell hit his nostrils, only now it was so powerful it turned his stomach. A voice called his name. Meg ran toward the church. It dawned on him then that Deirdre had not been at this morning's Mass. Dear Lord, what has happened? Together they headed back toward the O'Connors' cottage, Meg relaying her story as they walked. Da went out to check the potatoes early this morning just after the fog lifted. There was something white all over the stalks. He called us all out to help him. We dug up the stalks. They were covered with ugly sores. When Da cut into one, it was black and the smell nearly made us all sick. Her words scrambled as fast as her hurried steps. The fog was now gone, replaced by an almost tangible sense of foreboding. In the O'Connors' yard, they found the family standing over their potato bed, the stalks all cankered and strewn about, a white frost-like substance clinging to them. All stood with heads bowed, as though paying final farewells at a newly dug grave. Dennis, might I help? Together they dug up what they could salvage. At such an early stage in their growth, the potatoes were puny and didn't look as though they'd feed the family for very long. Father O'Malley helped carry them inside to the storage bin. I must tell you, Father, I'm not sure I've done the right thing. These few won't last long. I've got to save something for seed for next year. Once these are gone, what will we do? On the other hand, I'd rather have some than none. If I'd left them in the ground, who knows if they'd continue to grow or just go to mush like the others. Dennis, there's no way to tell the future. You make the decision you think is best and forgive yourself if it was wrong. I'll be hard-pressed to forgive myself if what I'm doing ends up starving my family. Father O'Malley stayed the rest of the morning. Just before noon, Rory and his father, Thomas Quinn, arrived to see how the O'Connors were faring. You dug them up, Dennis? Thomas asked. A skeptical look covered his weather-beaten face. Aye, we did, and what did you do? Ripped up the stalks, but we reburied the potatoes that weren't spoiled. For God's sake, Dennis, the canker is in the stalks. If it hasn't hit the potatoes yet, why not put them back in the ground? They may still grow. Aye, and they may not. I'd rather have the few I know I've got than take a chance on losing them all. But they won't last long nor be of much good. It's the decision I've made. Thomas argued no more, but the look on his face said he thought his friend had made a grave mistake. Father O'Malley had been speaking to Deirdre, trying to keep up her spirits, at the same time the two other men were talking. But he heard their conversation. Though Dennis would not show it, Father O'Malley knew he was tortured over his decision. Meg and Rory stood together. Father O'Malley started towards them, but stopped when he realized they were deep in their own conversation. Don't worry, Meg. When our potatoes come up, I'll save some for you, as many as I can. You won't go hungry if I can help it. And what makes you think your Da's right and mine's wrong? I didn't mean to insult your Da, Meg, but do you really think you'll go long on those little pebbles he's dug up? He should have left them in the ground. It was a stupid thing to take them now. No more stupid than leaving perfectly good potatoes in the ground to rot so you'll have nothing. I'm the one who'll have to save potatoes for you. Meg turned toward the cottage. Meg, wait! She went straight inside and slammed the door. Rory started after her, but Father O'Malley grabbed his arm. Let her be for now, lad. Father O'Malley spent a bit longer with the men, then prepared to leave. He wanted to see as many other parish families as possible and offer whatever consolation and encouragement he could. Dennis, Thomas, my prayers are with you and your families. Thank you, Father. I fear we'll be needing the power of himself to make it through this one, said Thomas. Dennis said nothing, just stared at the ground. The sound of a door banging shut made them all look up. Meg emerged from the cottage. I was just leaving, Meg, but I will be praying for you all. Thank you, Father. Meg stood with her hands on her hips, feet firmly planted in the muddy ground. She looked Father O'Malley in the eye. We've had difficult years before, but we made it through. We will again. The O'Connors were the first family Father O'Malley had met in Kelligeen, and they'd quickly become friends. He remembered quite vividly the night of Meg's birth. He had only been in the village a few days. Stopping by the O'Connors' cottage one evening in early January, he had found Dennis pacing outside the door. What are you doing outside? Father O'Malley had to yell the question over the wind roaring across the countryside. Deirdre's chimes come. The midwife's been with her all afternoon. They tossed me out to the manure pile," Dennis had yelled back. Together they stood, rubbing their hands, heads bowed and shoulders hunched. Without warning, the door cracked open and the midwife popped her head out. She spoke, but the wind ate her words, and the two men only saw her mouth move. She closed the door as quickly as she'd opened it. "I've had enough of this," Dennis yelled and went in. He'd left the door open behind him, but Father O'Malley felt it was not his place to be in the cottage at such a time. He didn't want the new mother and baby to take a chill, so he'd leaned in to catch the door handle and pull it shut. In those few seconds, he heard two things that set his mind forever on the character of Meg O'Connor. The first came from the midwife. "You've a girl child, and a wee banshee of a lass she is too. Not only did she give her own mother a rough go of it, but I'll be devilled if she didn't wiggle so hard in my hands I almost dropped the new sprout." The second was the sound of the infant's cry. It was strong and lusty, and powerful enough to carry over the fury of the raging January wind. As Father O'Malley walked back to his cottage, he thought to himself, what interesting characters the good Lord drops down upon this earth. Now Father O'Malley had a strong feeling that if anyone could fight the awful battle of hunger that surely would come, Meg O'Connor was the one. A few weeks later, Meg was with Rory, his parents, and his brother Aidan when they decided to dig up the potatoes they had left in the ground. Thomas was nervous. "I can't stand not knowing if we've got food out there or not." Meg knelt in the dirt at Rory's side while Thomas and his wife Anna dug into the ground. "Oh, dear Lord," Anna gasped, quickly crossing herself when she saw the piles of stinking black mush they unearthed. Thomas looked at his wife and two eldest sons kneeling in the dirt beside him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Meg watched the notch in Rory's throat move up and down. She put her hand into his, entwining their fingers. Dirt from both their hands smeared one to the other. Anna rubbed her husband's arm. "Thomas, don't blame yourself." Aidan said nothing but stared at the ground in disbelief. Rory looked at his father. "Nearly everyone did the same, Da." He glanced at Meg. "Almost everyone." She gave his hand a squeeze. "Let's not tell the wee ones yet," Anna pleaded. "They'll know soon enough." The family pig wound its way in and out among them, but even the pig would have nothing to do with the black gunk. The weeks progressed and autumn arrived, bringing with it a drop in temperature, which seemed to intensify everyone's now familiar hunger pangs. On an evening in mid-October, after Bridget was asleep for the night, the rest of the O'Connor family huddled together in a corner of the cottage. "That was the last of it," Dennis whispered, referring to the potatoes. That evening's supper had finished off the year's meager harvest. "We've still a few eggs and a bit of cheese, though I wish we'd been stingier with the 2 chickens, Deirdre said. "Other than that, there's some oatmeal. I'll stretch it all as far as I can, but everyone's portions will be smaller." "We've got those turnips that Brendan pulled from the field," Kathleen offered. "Do you really think they're safe to eat?" asked Brendan. "The gentry's cattle don't die from eating them. God knows they don't think of us as much better." Dennis's whisper was harsh. "Hush, you'll wake the lass," Deirdre admonished. "Rory's man says you can cook them just like potatoes," Meg explained. "He says they aren't too awful if you can forget you're eating cattle fodder." Deirdre stared with disdain at the 2 turnips she held. "They'll have to do, I suppose." The pig grunted in her sleep, nestling closer to her 2 piglets. "At least that will keep a roof over our heads for a while," Dennis said. The animal was to be sold the following month to pay the rent money due on Gale Day. Thank God she birthed a couple more. May they stay healthy. The Great Famine began in 1845 and continued to 1851, with 1847, sometimes known as Black 47, being the worst year. This was not the first or last famine Ireland would endure, but it was the worst. Over 1 million Irish died from starvation or starvation-related diseases. About another million emigrated, mostly to North America, settling in Canada and the United States. Many who could not pay their rent were evicted, their humble homes either torn down or burned. With nowhere to live, they wandered the countryside, often building tiny 3-sided structures carved into hillsides called scalpines where they secretly lived. Since Irish peasants rented the land and their cottages, it was illegal to take in those who had been evicted, so to do so was to invite their own eviction. As the famine dragged on over a 6-year period, conditions deteriorated. Death was ever present, and the Irish became desperate for survival. Begging and petty theft became common. Some who were caught stealing food were deported to Australia. Though a small number of landlords paid for passage of their tenants on ships bound for North America, most did not. Proposals for government-assisted emigration from Ireland were denied by Sir Charles Trevelyan, the director of the British government's Irish relief measures. Trevelyan stated that, quote, "The great evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people." The London Times referred to the famine as a great blessing and a valuable opportunity for settling the vexed question of Irish discontent. The Times advocated replacing evicted Irish by imported English and Scottish farmers who would, in their eyes, be thrifty, loyal, and Protestant. From these sentiments, you can see that many English had a low opinion of the Irish. Little help was forthcoming from that country. The Irish had only their own faith and perseverance on which to rely. Those who managed to scrape together the passage money set sail on rickety ships packed so full they could barely move. Not every ship made it to its destination. Disease was rampant on board, and so many passengers died during the crossing that some became known as coffin ships. But their determination to survive pushed the Irish immigrants. Young, unmarried women were the most common passengers. Like Meg O'Connor, they made the perilous journey on the slim hope of arriving in a new land in one piece and healthy enough to take on the rigors of adjusting to an unfamiliar land and culture. The fact that so many Megs landed and then bloomed with great success in America and around the world is a testament to the will and determination of the Irish people. It would seem that Sir Trevelyan was a bit mistaken in his assessment of the Irish character. Thank you.